All right. So, Melanie, I'm really glad to be here and continuing our conversation today. And I just want to say that I noticed that you have a really interesting background, and I was hoping that you'd be able to share a little bit more about your experiences.
Yeah, when you first said that, I was like, is it interesting? What you mean is my personal background and my professional background. I think of myself as a little bit of a recovering lawyer. I currently work at the law school at UC Berkeley in the career development office. And what I do is I work with students who are pursuing careers in public interest and social justice. And I help them, I do counseling and advising with them, helping them figure out what they want to do, a little bit of professional development around that stuff. And then a lot of program that helps bring to the surface different ways that you could do public interest or social justice work in your career as a lawyer, which I came to from doing civil rights work in the LGBTQ space myself at an organization called the National Center for Lesbian Rights, which I did for several years before coming to Berkeley. And that work, civil rights in the LGBTQ space, that was what I went to law school to do. I actually wrote an essay for law school, like scholarship funding, where I described that my goal in going to law school was to undermine the gender binary. I wrote that essay for admission in the fall of 2001, and my partner at the time, who's trans, he was like, you can't put that in there. Those people are not going to get it, and they are not going to give you the money. So I changed it to being about something else that's true for me, which is also how important it is that all different family structures be respected by our culture and by the law. That was the angle for law school. And so I put that in there, and that worked, and I did get the money. But so I came to the law because I am super invested in changing how our world works around gender and sexual orientation and family. Well, so at the same time that I was looking to make the transition from doing civil rights work into working in the law school space, which is a space where I get to be in a support role for people, be a resource for people, really focus on making connections with people every single day. I meet with between 2 and 8 students every single day. And I try to have a genuine, meaningful connection and conversation with every single one of them. And it works most of the time, which is amazing. And as I was looking to make that transition, I talked to somebody who had done a mediation training, and I was sort of feeling dissatisfied with the way that it felt to litigate. And I was thinking about mediation as something in addition to working with students. And this person was like, oh, you've got to take the training from Center for Understanding Conflict, Green Gulch, blah, blah, Gary Friedman, et cetera. And I was like, okay, I'll do that. And it took another 4 years before I actually took the training. So I was at Berkeley for a few years, but it was always on my mind that I would take the training. And I finally was able to sign up for it and went and did it. And, tried to go in being like, okay, this person probably oversold it. It's probably not that transformative. And then I was there and I was like, oh no, it is transformative, but I wouldn't have been able to predict in what way. Because I was already on board with sort of the idea, but for me, actually, the way that it was a turning point was that I had understood on an intellectual level that I was disconnected from my feelings and my emotionality. But in the legal space, it just nobody cared. Nobody ever saw that as a problem. It was kind of a strength. But in this context, I was able to see suddenly how much work I had to do if I wanted to link those things back up, and how valuable that would be for me, and how meaningful that would be, and how that would make me better able to be the person that I want to be in the world. I didn't totally understand that was the missing piece. But I did, have a sort of a training moment. It was on the Friday, in the middle of the training, and, getting very aggressively coached by Gary, but assertively coached by Gary, I should say, to to actually feel what the party was feeling. And I thought I understood what that meant, but then I realized I did not understand what that meant. And that really changed pretty much going forward from that. I've been working to just rebuild that sort of the highway between my feelings and my thoughts, which for me was like very kind of sort of blocked off or like broken, and also at the end of that training, but I love the training and I had so much fun, and I just had so much fun the entire time. And Gary sort of said, Catherine and I think that you might be good at training this if you would like to do that. And I was like, I would like to do that. I would like to start today. I would immediately like to start doing this. So it wasn't immediate. That sort of kicked off a number of years of doing student teaching stuff, which has been really great. And I feel so happy and optimistic about the future of the center and all the different kinds of trainings that we can do, given our focus on really helping people learn, because that was my experience, was like, I really learned here and that's what matters. And now I am excited to get to be a part of helping that be true for other people.
So can I ask, like, when you were writing your paper, like, do you feel like you had to like accommodate the norms, societal norms, in order to like for your paper and your funding to be accepted?
Well, so for that one, what my partner at the time was pointing out was there wasn't even the understanding there of what I would even be talking about. So there was a risk that I would submit this thing and it would have terms and language in it that the reader would be like, I have no idea where this person's coming from or talking about. I'm not going to take it upon myself to research this. I'm just not going to fund them. And so I needed to tell a story that I knew that the reader was going to be able to hear.
Okay.
Which was an accommodation of where things were at that point. And it's so amazing actually to think about, like, that was 2001, now it's 2021. I still always be careful. I'm always careful to define my terms. Like when I say gender binary, what I'm talking about is the division of our concept of gender into a masculine and a feminine. It's a binary, one or the other, masculine or feminine. But so many more people are familiar with those concepts already, because of all the work that so many people have been doing for the last 20 years. So it's kind of amazing to be alive to see those changes happening.
So like it's come, like, would you feel like people's understanding and their foundation, or at least their foundational understanding of the issues and the terminology, or I should say, people's foundational understanding of the terminology has come a longer way in the past 20 years?
Definitely. And we also see how far we have to go. And I think there's understanding and like familiarity. That's one thing, and that's important. And then there's acceptance or welcoming, and that's another thing, or just comfort level. And I think we've gotten to the place where well-meaning liberals know that you're not supposed to be homophobic and you're not supposed to be transphobic, and they know that they are supposed to support practices and laws and everything that create equality or fairness for people who are queer or people who are trans. I think at this point, like, liberal America is on board with this project, like 100%. Whereas in 2001, I think, liberal people might not openly disagree with it, but they wouldn't necessarily have included it in the pantheon of equality issues that they were concerned about, if that makes sense. So we've made that leap, but there's a lot that needs to still be done and a lot that needs to be changed. And especially because, the way that race and white supremacy interact with transphobia, homophobia, heterosexism, and with ableism and with patriarchy and everything else, that's still, that's the core of what we need to look at. And that's looking at like people's formal rights around like marriage and other stuff like that is great, but there's a lot more we need to understand about that.
What are some more things that you feel like people need to understand?
I want That's an interesting, I don't know why it's hard to answer that question as you put it. Well, I'll just say for myself, like I'm not speaking for anybody else at all. But for me, on a daily level, I would really like the kind of consciousness raising around gender binary assumptions that is also needing to take place around white supremacy, around ableism, around class in America, like all this kind of stuff. I would like for everybody to understand that our culture is in the grip of a belief about how gender works that is reinforced by capitalism, all of the buying of gendered products, all of the selling of needing to do various things based on needing to act out your gender in the best way. It's very subtle in our current culture because consumers don't want to get hit over the head with it. So it's more subtle, but it still is operating at every level. That all of that is not real.
Mm-hmm.
And that we don't need to participate in it and we don't need to think of ourselves that way. And that's where I'm coming from. There are people who, in trans communities, in queer communities, who appreciate the presence of gender concepts like masculinity and femininity as things to perform or do, move between. There are people who have a deeply felt sense of being a particular gender who are trans. There are also cisgender people who have that deeply felt sense. And so I don't want to criticize that because that's everybody's individual experience. And culturally, we are so bought in and we don't need to be. Mm-hmm. And it's a problem for us because it impedes freedom in a lot of really intense ways.
So would it be fair to say from your perspective, and as you mentioned, like you are speaking for yourself, but it sounds like based on what you're saying that you feel like there are a lot of, I don't want to say necessarily like fantasy, I'm trying to think of a different word, but like people have this perception of reality around gender and these constructs that aren't necessarily accurate, and they're quite limiting for identity. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I think it's limiting. And again, I'm really only talking about at the cultural level. I'm not talking about anybody's individual experience of their gender, that's real for them. That all of our experiences of gender are real for all of us. And our culture is harmful the way that it is.
And I guess kind of what spurred our conversation was the fact that we were talking about how June is Pride Month. And, Pride Month does honor the Stonewall Uprising, and it's considered the tipping point for the gay liberation movement in the United States. During June, many organizations and people like to celebrate LGBTQIA plus identities and history. But it's also a time where we highlight a lot of the inequalities and discrimination. And I'm just wondering how do you think mediators and other people who work with conflict can be more supportive and inclusive, not only in their work, but their lives all the time?
It's the same practice that we all need to engage in around all of our other assumptions that we might be bringing to the table about other people, and not necessarily even judgments, like it might not flag to you internally as a judgment, but just the assumption. For example, like assumptions about family structure. I'm sensitive to that because I was raised by my grandparents and had the experience growing up of always needing to correct people or like write in a special thing on my school forms or like, whatever thing. And I didn't get a lot of friction around it, but I just noticed that the world was not expecting me, which is crazy because so many kids are raised by people other than their parents, right? I think in queer community, we have a long and super proud history of chosen family, of embracing family structures that are different from the heteronormative, two parents, different gender, married, biological kids, like all those norms that lots of other people also don't live by and that don't reflect reality for most people. But in queer community, we've really embraced our differentness. And having chosen family, trying to have intergenerational chosen families. So people my age, making sure that we have friends and mentors and chosen family members that are in the Stonewall generation, trying to make those connections with younger people as well. So assumptions that people's lives or families look a certain way, I think queer people are among the people who are impacted by that. When someone asks me if I'm married now in American culture, like that could mean anything because of the law, but that's a fairly recent change. And I definitely have the experience of being sort of an invisible queer person because of my gender conformity, actually. I look like somebody that people read as female. I don't correct that assumption when people meet me. And so I can also sometimes be assumed to be straight because people think that gender non-conforming people are the gay people, if that makes sense. So just checking all those assumptions about people and what people's lives look like, I think is super important and is what we should be doing as mediators anyway. That was a long-winded answer, sorry.
No, that's fine. This is your space to take up as you want. And so it sounds like so if I'm a mediator, working with people, then one of the things that I should really be mindful of, in one of the blind spots that I should be really kind of more mindful of, is how am I defining family, and not excluding the principles of chosen family, where the bonds and the relationships can be as strong, if not stronger, than with biological family, and that looking at family from a biological perspective can be really narrowing, and inconsiderate of the experiences and realities that a lot of people face.
I think that's true. And I feel like, like for queer people, that looks lots and lots of different ways, but it's also like, there are differences across different cultures about who's close family. Another experience that I have is that for a good chunk of my time as a young person, I lived with my aunt and uncle and two cousins, and my cousins are like siblings. And I find that there are some people who come from backgrounds where I say my cousin and somebody's going to understand what I'm talking about, like what kind of relationship that is for me. And there is a dominant culture, which I would associate with like whiteness in America and a certain level of privilege, where the nuclear family unit is like very dominant. Where when I say cousin, nobody understands what that means to me. It doesn't seem that meaningful. And there's an assumption that it's not meaningful. It's easy for me to correct. It's not a huge deal, but it's just about where are the defaults, and people not thinking that they have a default.
So would you say then, like, that the nuclear family isn't necessarily what we should consider to be a default for family? Is that maybe
I would love for us to not think about a default.
No deal. I like that. No default.
I just realized that I should say something else though, which is that, like, I live in an urban progressive area where, because of marriage equality and other things, like I can say what I said before about, like, people being ready to hear that I'm married to a woman, for example. I'm actually not married, but like that example. And I understand that there are lots and lots of other places in America where that is the law, but that is not how people are thinking. So just want to acknowledge the context that I come out of with that.
I was just wondering if you could give me a little bit more in depth on your perspective about sex roles and stereotyping.
Yeah, so where I come from with this is I think about this all the time, because in my job away from CUC, where I work at the law school, and one of my jobs is to help educate students on what it means to show up looking professional in the legal profession, because that's what you need to do to get a job. I'm constantly in a position of explaining our norms to students, and I try super hard not ever to just tell them they need to look professional, but to put content behind that, which aligns with our model of mediation, right? That, like, you don't make assumptions, that you just be specific about what is the what. And in the context of professionalism, one of the things that I come up against all the time is how deep sex role stereotypes are in professionalism. And then that is also true in other ways that people are expected to be in our culture, like what it is to be nice, what it is to be responsible, what it is to be a good parent, to be a good child, like a good friend. All of that stuff has sex role content in our culture. But where I live in my job is talking about that in the context of professionalism. And how deeply embedded sex role stereotypes are in what people perceive as professional behavior or unprofessional behavior, or especially professional appearance or unprofessional appearance, and how damaging that is for people whose own concept of what they want to be like in the world, in this context as a professional, as a lawyer, is neither the stereotypical male professionalism or the stereotypical female professionalism. I think people have fought super hard to have sex equality in the context of places like professionalism. So I encounter some pushback when I say that, usually, to people. But the truth is, it's there. And all I need to do to explain that is ask what happens when somebody that someone reads as male shows up to a job interview wearing nail polish for a law firm. For a lot of jobs, nobody cares anymore. For a law firm, people are going to notice and they're going to think, that's cute if he wants to wear that on his spare time, but like, we can't have somebody putting themselves forward as a professional in this space and wearing nail polish. But what they mean is, we can't have somebody coded male wearing nail polish in this space, because women can wear nail polish all they want. There's race and class content around what color can the nail polish be? How long can your nails be? Can you have nail art? Like, all that stuff has a lot of like white supremacy and classist content in it still. But sex role stereotypes are accepted at that basic level all over the place in our culture. And so that's the kind of thing that I really I love just looking out for it. It's like, once you see it, you can't unsee it. And it's kind of a fun game to play with our culture, just to look for that stuff. But I think you got to pair it with looking for white supremacy, looking for classism, looking for ableism, looking for ageism. That's another one that is so huge in our culture that people don't talk about on the regular, I think, in most spaces, but you have to look at all of those things together.
You were talking about like nail polish for like an interview at a law firm, for example, and based on how you're talking or what you were describing, it sounds like a lot of these ideas and constructs permeate all of our society as a whole, and it sounds like it's a hindrance to a lot of people from just pursuing, their professions and their lives. And I'm just curious, do you feel like the legal profession and the legal realm is a little bit more archaic and stuck on these white supremacist and these like these white supremacist and exclusive ideas of what is professional?
I mean, I definitely think that in the legal profession specifically, we've baked in certain elitism, because there is, for some people, the fact that not everybody is the point. Mm-hmm. But that's not how most of us think about the profession anymore. And that's not something people want to hold. So when you raise that kind of thing, I think people in the legal profession are troubled, but often because we're risk averse people, people will be like, well, I don't care if he's wearing nail polish, that's great, but what's the judge going to think, or what's the client going to think? So there's a lot of that in the legal profession, a lot of fear. It's fear. It's fear of being seen as not doing your job right by allowing someone else to show up wearing nail polish.
Which seems so like such a silly thing to not take somebody professionally or take somebody seriously because they might identify as male and they're wearing nail polish in the courtroom. Yeah,
right. So we just have to have these conversations and keep having them, because I think most people at a personal level are like, yeah, I don't care about the nail polish. Like, it's true. We don't need to hang on to that. But there's so many nail polishes. There's so many things. It's like each individual thing. And so that's why everybody needs to just like tune their lens a little bit to start looking for that stuff. I feel like when it comes to appearance, there's a flag on the minute you notice something about someone's appearance and you catch yourself feeling like it's not what it's supposed to be. I would just run the checklist. Like, do I feel this way because of how their gender is expressed in what they're doing? Is it that I think it's overly casual? Why is casual a problem? Does it look cheap? Why is how much something cost a problem? Like, and, running through all of that. But that's just the space of professional attire. But obviously, like, we form all kinds of judgments about people all the time. So, but that's my little layer that I'm concerned with all the time right now. And that's law specific, but I know that other professions, mediators, our community at CUC is a lot of other folks aren't just like law involved, but I think we all have versions of this. Law is just really intense that way.
Yeah. What a lot of the things that you're saying, I feel like they're applicable in a lot of different intersectionalities in the spaces that we work and that we live, and the spheres that we influence as well. Um, and there, I think it's also, beyond gender appearance. I'm just curious. You had talked last week too a little bit about gender essentialism, and I was wondering if you could define that and talk a little bit more about what that is and why that's important.
Yeah, so this is something else that I love talking about with people because it's baked into our culture, and I think it's useful to have a label for it, which is gender essentialism is the idea that there is a masculinity and a femininity that tie to being a particular gender, man or woman, and that those are fixed categories, and that we can't do anything about that. That's how I would define it. There's probably better definitions on the internet. I did not look this up beforehand. So that's my own definition that I just came out with out of my brain. But there are people who do more thinking and talking about this than me who could probably do a better job. But the reason that I care about it is that I want to help us question and probably get away from making assumptions about what is or isn't possible with somebody based on gender and the place that they occupy in our culture around that. And I feel like that sounds like obvious, like, of course, it's 2021, men can do anything, women can do anything, but considering someone's gender as an essential part of their self, I think is something that we should query, again, not their own feelings about that, but how we look at them about that.
Would it be fair to say that one of the things that mediators and conflict resolution professionals can do is to be more fluid with their understanding of what we would consider to be like gender normative characteristics?
Do you mean just more familiar with like thinking about gender, like ideas and concepts around gender?
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just like race and just like class and just like ableism, like everything, every time we find out that a particular strand of identity is also a site of oppression for some people in our cultures, then we need to educate ourselves about that area. If we hold privilege in that area in particular, like we might not need to educate ourselves if we don't hold privilege in that area because we already know, but like, and I think when it comes to queerness and gender, I'm not talking about sexual orientation that much because I feel like so much of people's reactions around sexual orientation have either to do with gender essentialism, actually, expecting people to hold their particular performance of gender, or with fear of things that they associate with sex, which is a whole nother conversation about our culture. But so looking at things from the gender lens, I think that all of us are better if we start really questioning gender and these concepts. And then but that's super theoretical. And I feel like we have to link that to, like, very concretely, we need to take the leadership of trans women of color, in particular, Black trans women, Latina trans women, Asian trans women of color with disabilities, older trans women. We have to take that leadership around what are solutions for some of these issues, and not just engage with them on a theoretical level, but also look, like, who are the people who have been doing activism on the ground to make our culture better for decades, and do what they say, listen to them and do what they say, and give them the resources to continue to lead us, because that's where all this opening up comes from. It's not so much like the theoretical level, but I do think there's a space for thinking about gender in particular in theory, and just understanding that it's an idea.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that it's particularly important, not simply just engaging, but actually having trans women of color take the leadership positions and really following their example and following their lead.
Right. Yeah. And sending resources that way and trusting those leaders to do the culture and political and legal change work that needs to be done. I mean, and showing up in whatever way you're called to show up, but that's where the leadership needs to come from.
And I had another question because you've brought up ableism a few times. And I know that we didn't go in depth in our last conversation, but I was just wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit more about ableism and how this intersects with our topic.
Yeah, so I think about ableism a lot from a personal level. Like I think about it a lot because I have MS, and so the experience of having a disability has helped me along in terms of having like a critical perspective on all that, and then also like just understanding how ableist our culture is. But there are some really visionary leaders in the racial justice, gender justice, like disability justice spaces who have talked about this a lot. And one person I would really recommend is someone named Lydia XZ Brown. They are an autistic person who identifies as, uses they, them pronouns, identifies as trans, and their lawyering work is around always addressing simultaneously ableism, white supremacy, and sort of transphobic or gender essentialist, like however you want to put it, addressing all those things together at once. And there's also the Disability Justice Project at the Transgender Law Center, led by Sebastian Margaret, who also talks about disability justice, which is different from disability rights, talks about disability justice always through a white supremacy lens, a class lens, and a gender and sexual orientation, but gender lens. And that's the only way we are going to get anywhere with addressing any of these issues, because you can't just take one in isolation. Specifically around disability and queer stuff, there's a lot to think about in terms of how we expect people's bodies to be, but that also intersects with race. What we consider to be like an okay human body and what those human bodies can do, that implicates all of these things together.
Interesting. And, we've had a lot of discussions, like as an organization as a whole, about, when people are learning about different issues, and particularly, like white, progressive, liberal people, there's this tendency to really like want to take action. And if somebody's listening to our conversation and they're like, okay, well, I want to do something about this and I want to move into that next step, what do you recommend they do?
I mean, I think self-reflection, that of course, like Center for Understanding and Conflict, we used to go straight to self-reflection always, but I think self-reflection is the first thing to engage with. And some questions you can ask yourself are, what do I feel internally about my own gender? What is my relationship to the gender that the world reads me to be? And to the extent that I have or have not struggled with that in my life, why have I or have I not struggled with it in my life? Just to sort of like build up your own understanding of yourself and then build your capacity for empathy with other people around that. And I think the other thing in terms of education that I would do, I would read the stuff that's put out by the Disability Justice Project at Transgender Law Center, and Lydia XC Brown has their own website and has some really good stuff on there. And that's just a good place to get some ideas flowing. But I think it always does start and continue with self-reflection. So really thinking about the space that you occupy in the world around your own gender and all of these other things too. I mean, you can do it together with thinking about, if you're white, your relationship to white supremacy, thinking about it with relationship to your relationship to class, to ability, or, ideas about being healthy or sick, all of that kind of stuff, to age for sure. And how does thinking about age relate back to your thinking about gender? Because for almost everybody in our culture, it definitely does. So, yeah.
So it sounds like, it's important for ourselves to take like a deep dive in our own understanding of, not just our gender identity, but all of these different things, like you mentioned, age, and how that really ties into our understanding of the constructs of the world, And from there, that's where we can kind of look more outward and have I guess, a clearer view of how we're impacting the world around us, but also being able to find those additional points of connection for developing empathy.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love us to get to a place where what we neither expect other people to do this to us, nor do this to other people, where we see somebody and we think we know from what they look like what their gender is. Like, and I think a lot of people are ready for that because on some level, because they've been introduced to the fact that there are folks out there who identify as non-binary, other stuff like that. That's great. I'm not talking about non-binary folks. I'm saying when you look at me, stop thinking, oh, I know who that is. That's a woman. Like, that would be an amazing place for us to get to as a culture.
I agree. I definitely agree. When you were talking about your background, you mentioned that you're a recovering lawyer. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. What do you mean by the fact that you're a recovering lawyer?
Well, there's two kinds of people in the world, people who went to law school and people who never went to law school. And everybody who went to law school knows what I mean about it does some stuff to your brain and you can take that on in whatever way you want to take it on, but it does some stuff to your brain that you can't really undo in terms of seeing the world around what risks are created by various things and a certain analytical approach to the world. And there's lots of great things about that. Like, I'm not here to denigrate it. But when I went to law school and I hear from students that they're feeling that it's still the same way, one of the kind of underlying concepts of legal education in America is that your humanity is fine. We're not saying you're not allowed to have it, but it's of limited utility. What we really need is to understand things in a certain way and proceed from there. And then what Center for Understanding and Conflict does for people who are lawyers, for a lot of us, I think, is like help us see our way to bringing our humanity back to the work that we do. And different lawyers find different ways to do that. I had to step away from suing people. I didn't find that it was in alignment with my values to engage in the kind of talk about people that you have to engage in order to sue them. Like, I was suing some people who had done some bad stuff, so that's fine, but you have to cast things a certain way in the legal profession to get a certain result in the court. And that's just how it's all structured, and it's fine. For me, that ended up feeling pretty out of alignment. And especially actually in the civil rights nonprofit space, the way that the communication works is like you file a complaint against somebody and then you put out a press release and you talk about what a bigot they are. And that accomplishes a certain goal. Didn't feel like a fit for me, even though people had done very bad things and did deserve to be held accountable.
It sounds like, it's not that you really have an issue with the fact that you're like that part of this process in civil litigation is putting out these press releases and calling people out. It's more along the lines of that for you and the values that you hold, that's not the way that you want to go about doing this kind of work.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if I need to have an opinion on what our culture should be like around all that. I just got to a point where I didn't feel like I could participate in it. And I think when I say that it's okay, what I mean is I totally understand why my friends who are still in that space still move that way in that space. And I'm not really feeling motivated to critique that. I just know from my own experience that I needed to do something differently.
And is there anything else that you want to add to this conversation that maybe I didn't ask you about?
I feel like I should add something. I always want to take this opportunity, but I just think, as with everything else, it's easy for me to get caught up in talking about ideas, and I feel like I've done a lot of talking about ideas, but where the action really happens is with our own experience. And so, thinking about, for Pride Month or for thinking about how we engage around sexual orientation and gender identity, like, I just want to encourage everybody to return to their own experience and really look at their experience of themselves and their experience of other people around that, and move out from there, I guess.
So a self-reflection of our own experiences.
Self-reflection and taking the leadership of trans women of color and disabled folks. And yeah.
Well, thank you. I know even though we spoke a lot about this topic last week, I just feel like there's even more that you've brought up today. And I really appreciate that you took the time to share your experiences and your background and to talk about this.
Thank you for talking with me. It's so fun to talk with you about this stuff because your questions are so thoughtful. So,
well, thank you. I appreciate it.